Khoury from the AUB Media Studies Program. Welcome to the AUB Beirut COVID-19 briefings episode for this week, where every week we have a discussion with an AUB professor to talk about issues related to the COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic and issues related to it in society as a whole. We are delighted this week to have as our guest Professor Bashshar Haydar from the Department of Philosophy of AUB to talk about some of the ethical and philosophical and social issues that people are grappling with without knowing that these are deep philosophical issues. And we will turn to New York to our colleague Alison Freeland, who will be there to anchor the questions that come in from our audience. Alison, you're there?
Hi, thank you. Thank you for Professor Haydar. And I would like to encourage anyone who's watching on Facebook Live to use the chat feature to ask questions and make comments. Thanks so much.
Professor Haydar, welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks for the team in the communication office.
Well,
yeah, I mean, I'm afraid this topic has been over-discussed, and I think people might feel oversaturated with the discussion of COVID, so we might run the risk of boring them to death. But hopefully we'll be able to shed some new light and make new twists on the debate. So,
well, with you answering questions and me asking them, I think no one's going to get bored, because you're going to have some really interesting things, provocative, thought-provoking things to say about dimensions maybe that people haven't thought about very much, but actually deal with every day. Let me start by saying, or asking you, in a recent article on a website called CAP-X, that's CAP-X, which is a site for philosophy scholars and philosophers to talk about issues of common interest. You wrote an article with a colleague where you tackled the ethics of a pandemic. And you started to discuss questions from different angles, including individual rights versus collective community rights. You talked about making decisions in normal times or emergency times, and other things related to this process. What got you thinking about this issue? And can you explain to us the key points that you wanted to make in that article?
Well, the main concern, which is a common concern, is about how you make trade-offs between safety, curbing the pandemic, versus opening the economy. And this was, it's still a debate, ongoing debate. It was a fierce debate in the US with the president there, and lots of the Republicans are in favor of opening up the economy, reducing the fears or understating the fears of the pandemic. And others were saying, no, we need to actually take it seriously and close down. And this debate, we think, it's not only purely about scientific issues. It's not only a medical debate. It's not only about what's the rate of infection, what kind of death rate we will see if we don't close the economy. There are ethical questions involved. Ethical questions have to do with the kind of trade-offs we want to make between the different communities, different interest groups, and the different things we value, because there are, at each side of the trade-off, there are things we value, and we have to make a trade-off between those things we value. So I think it's not a purely scientific claim, and that's why the ethical and political component are important, because when you make policy decisions, you need to know your scientific facts or facts related to the issue at hand, but that will not get you an answer. You need also to make ethical judgments and to think about those ethical judgments and the principles and the factors that are relevant for having good grip on them, so that you end up with a reasonable ethical decision.
So who makes the decision? Is there a consensus among philosophers and philosophy scholarship, among people in public life as far as you can follow it? Is there a consensus that the individual makes the ultimate decision, or that in some cases the individual's agency and right to live as an individual is overridden by the common good?
And if you're looking for consensus among philosophers, you'll definitely be disappointed. But I think a kind of knowledge emerges, a kind of better understanding emerge as a result of the discussion, not a consensus. Otherwise, it would be a boring discipline for me if there is an emerging consensus, you know. But when it comes to the decision making, of course, people in institutions have to make decisions. For example, shutting down economy is decided by, you know, governments, by governors, by prime minister, depending on the situation and the country. But the way these decisions emerge, they are influenced by the debate surrounding them. So different groups, different people, different interests, different arguments are thrown in the kind of market of ideas, and those decision makers are definitely influenced by those views. They're influenced also by the team they set together to decide, but that team itself is influenced by what they expose to in media, in academic articles, and because of that COVID-19 situation is a fluid situation, people are always on the look for new evidence, new scientific revelations, as well as arguments that would guide them through that kind of difficult terrain of navigating the risks of COVID-19 and the risks of different policies that are associated with it.
So what we've seen in many countries, maybe even all countries around the world, this incredible debate about should we open up the economy, should we wear masks, should we do this to let our kids go to school. It's a political debate at one level among all people in society, and it's a very personal, ethical debate within one's own conscience. Who makes the final decision? Does society have a norm that says the ultimate decision is going to be made by X?
Again, my thinking is that it's not important who makes the decision. We already have a system where people make decisions. The question is on what basis they make that decision, and whether they make those bases clear to the people, and they engage in the public debate so that their decisions end up being informed. So I don't have a say in the decision, but I hope when I write something that this might affect people who might affect others, who might end up being the people who make decisions. So this is how we contribute as scholars and as intellectuals and as people interested, as activists, to the decision making. Not by being ourselves necessarily in decision making, but by being doing the kind of trickle down or up effect, which will influence decision. So I think it's more interesting to look at the basis for decision rather than who makes it. Of course, it's important to look at who makes it, but that will be a different context of setting up a policy about who makes such decisions. But ultimately, it's a political decision.
Right, and the decision is made by political institutions like parliaments and governments or governors or whatever.
When it comes to your own personal behavior, then it's your decision, of course, whether you are, if it's left to you to decide whether to wear a mask or not, for example, so the policy doesn't say, then it's up to you, and then you have to make a personal decision, and that also needs to be a decision which is informed. We make lots of decisions like that. We decide not to eat meat. There is no policy against eating meat, but we decide personally based on moral reasons or other kinds of reasons not to eat meat. So there are a room for personal decision, and there it's clear who makes the decision. It's you, it's us. But in the case of the policy that we are now discussing here, I think it's clearly a political body that makes decisions.
In the article that you wrote, you talked about the question is really about making decisions in normal times and making decisions in abnormal emergency times. Tell us a little bit about that difference.
Yeah, I mean, in the discussion about opening up the economy or closing it down to save lives and to limit infections and therefore fatalities, people look at how to weigh lives versus economic flourishing. And one argument is that life should trump economic well-being. Life is more important.
Right.
And you might use examples for that. And in this article, we use an example which was written some time ago by a philosopher at NYU, Peter Unger, which was also later used by well-known ethicist Peter Singer. And that example goes like this. You bought the guy is Bob. Bob buys a Bugatti, which is, a very famous, very, very expensive car. in millions, let's say.
Yeah.
He bought it as a retirement plan. He wants to sell it later and retire comfortably, but finds himself in a situation where he has either to save his Bugatti or save a child. There's a kind of a boulder rolling down the hill to hit the child, and the only way he can do is to put a rock to block, but the boulder, but then the boulder will go towards his car and smash his car. His car, for some reason, is uninsured yet.
Right.
Now, we think that faced with such situation, Bob or whoever owns the Bugatti should favor saving the child.
Right.
Child versus a Bugatti, you ought to save the child. And the child is a stranger child. The kind of morale of the story is that when we are faced with huge wealth versus life of a person, innocent person, then we ought to favor the innocent person's life. But if you apply this to the pandemic, it would follow that you have to sacrifice a lot of economic well-being for the sake of saving lives from the epidemic, which means that we have to favor shutting down, as long as not shutting down will jeopardize some lives.
Right.
So that's one reasoning. On the other hand, we don't think that people, when they buy expensive cars, they're doing something immoral, although they are able to sell those cars and spend the money to save lives.
Right.
You can save a lot of lives, even outside the pandemic, by selling a Bugatti.
Yes.
You know, $1 million, which would go a long way in saving poor people who are endangered. Their life is under danger in many countries in the world. So how come we have those two different attitudes? And our take in that article is that we treat emergencies differently than we treat normal cases. The child example is a kind of emergency. It's a one-time thing. It's an off thing that doesn't happen often.
Right.
And in those emergencies, we are expected to actually give up economic assets for the sake of saving lives.
Right.
But when the thing becomes part of the norm, we change our behavior. When it becomes a regular thing, we no longer required to give up that much. And that affects how we relate to the pandemic. Right. While the pandemic is an emergency, it's a one-off thing that's going to be limited in time, we think we are required to make sacrifices. But when this goes on and becomes part of what you call now, everybody calls the new norm, then we are no longer required to make the same sacrifices. We are allowed to pursue our lives, our projects. I'll give you an example. Take, for example, driving. Now, we could reduce the number of deaths from driving by reducing speed to 20 kilometers or 30. Of course, this will slow us all down, but it will slow the economy down.
Right.
But we don't do that, because those car accidents, although they are important, and the numbers are not small if you count them across the world, they're still more a year than the numbers we have for the pandemic.
Right.
But still, we don't do these extreme restrictions because we think death by car accident has become part of the norm.
Yes.
We don't simply do nothing, but we don't reduce speed limit to very safe levels. We require better brakes, speed limits in some cases, other safety regulations, but we don't try to actually eliminate deaths by cars, because we can't do that by basically making cars drive very low speed. Also, we allow people to actually use cars not only for necessities. You know, it's nothing wrong by you taking a ride,
right.
Which is, in a way, every time you take a ride, you are putting others at some degree of risk. And therefore, we have different attitudes between emergencies that are exceptional ones and ones that are part of the norm, even though what's at stake is the same in both cases. Right. So I think that's why we say that suppose we don't discover a vaccine for a long time, and we have to keep on locking down. I think the argument in favor of locking down when this becomes something we have to live with becomes less imperative.
Yeah.
But so long as it's confined, we think that we have a requirement to lock down. Yes.
We have some comments, questions from New York. Allison?
Yes, and we have greetings from Michigan and from Houston and from Beirut, and we have a comment that you are the best professor ever. And we have another comment thanking you, Professor Haydar, for being courageous and clear at this time. And a question is, what differences do you see culturally in ethics, if there are any, from country to country or East and West?
Let me connect it to the pandemic, this kind of difference. Because when we make the trade-off between reducing infection and fatalities, as well as trade-off between this and opening the economy, it makes a difference whether we talk about affluent society or talking about poor societies. Because there are several groups that are, everybody is affected badly by the pandemic, and everybody is affected badly by the lockdown.
But different degrees.
Different degrees, yeah. Greatly different degrees.
Yeah.
So you can think of groups that are more harmed by lockdown and groups that are more harmed by opening the economy. The groups that are harmed by the lockdown tend to be young, poor, working age. So those are harmed by the lockdown, and especially poor in poor countries, because in affluent countries, the governments have resources to step in and assist.
Yes.
Of course, this assistance comes at the expense of another group, which is future generations who will lose part of the money that's being spent on this. So you have young, working class, age earners, and future generations affected. Now, going back to the question about cultures, the effect on the working class is different when you are a working class in a poor country where you live from paycheck to paycheck, not even paycheck to paycheck, you don't even have checks, you live on daily earnings. A lockdown means you don't have enough to supply your family at the end of the day. And therefore, what the policy that might be justifiable in the US or Germany might not be equally justifiable in India.
No.
So that would create a different dynamic there, because what's at stake for the poor in India who earn on daily basis, or other places, maybe Lebanon is like that as well. But because Lebanon is a special case, you have more than one problem here.
Right.
So, but take for example, since we are an education institution, the effect on the poor from the lockdown in education is different. AUB is a university which had resources like many other universities in the Western world. We can operate online easily. I know from my friends who teach at the Lebanese university, in many branches it's not working. And therefore it means that the educational gap which exists already will even become bigger among the poor, between the rich and the poor, because even the online teaching is not accessible to them. So that kind of cultural, I would call social and political and economic difference, make a difference on how we assess things. So we have with the pandemic also a generational clash of some sort, because the people who will be more affected negatively by opening up and more positively by the lockdown are the old and retired.
Yes.
These people already have their wages secure. They have Medicare or some medical insurance, of course, in countries that have these kinds of welfare provisions. And therefore, they are less likely to be affected by the lockdown.
Right.
And the question now is, how do we make a trade-off between these two generations, the existing young one, the future generation on the one side, and the retired older generation? Yeah.
So in your classroom and among your colleagues in the philosophy department and other philosophy scholars that you're in touch with, but particularly I'm interested with your students. You're teaching summer school now, you just finished the spring course. Are these issues being discussed? Is there a new role for philosophers and philosophy scholars to raise these issues and help us in society either ask the right questions or try to figure out how do we find the right answers?
Yeah, I mean, since I'm teaching ethics classes and political philosophy, that comes, naturally. So we discussed some of these issues and actually shared with them that article I wrote. And we have it now. I discuss with my colleagues, but we don't have a formal forum for that. So yes, we do. In fact, now because of the people are getting used to talking to each other online, I've started to talk more to my colleagues abroad, and this is a collaboration as a result of a discussion with Alec Wallen, who's a professor of law at University of Rutgers. So yes, we have more time now to waste on such issues. So yes, we end up more productive.
Well, I wouldn't say it's wasted, but it's work that you do whose fruits will come to bear down the road probably. Do you find that there is any mechanism by which the philosophical method of analyzing issues, whether for the individual, for the family, for an institution like AUB or a company, and for the country and society as a whole, is there a role for philosophical inquiry that is perhaps more needed in society?
Well, I don't think it's needed more, but every time there is a kind of tough choice, we need to think about the ethical implications of those choices. And I think the need for philosophical discussion becomes more imperative. In the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, there are some issues that arise that you are familiar with in other contexts. For example, the use of ventilators. The use of ventilators, how do you ration ventilators? If you have a shortage of ventilators and there is a lot of demand, and we've seen these in some places, the question arises, who gets the ventilator?
Right.
This issue is very important in the case of the pandemic, but it's also exists in other contexts.
Right.
When you have organ transplant, for example, who gets the kidney or the liver?
Right.
Or in the case of wars, who gets to be treated?
Right.
And in those cases, we have to ration limited resources, vital resources, over oversupply, over demand for this limited supply. In these cases, we make choices which call triage in some lingo. Now, in the case of organ transplant, if you have an older person with medical conditions versus a younger person versus even a child, who do you give the organ to? Now, most people, if given a choice between a 50-year-old and a 75-year-old with underlying medical conditions, most people would choose to give the organ to the overall healthy younger one.
Yes.
And that people use actually to say that since most of the deaths of COVID are among the old, what we are losing here should not be seen in terms of how many lives, but in terms of how many years.
Wow.
And some people find this a bit cold-hearted, utilitarian calculation of years. We should not look at years, we should look at lives. But clearly we do look at years when we consider organ donations or who should get the organ. So people say, well, that's not unusual. We do look at years. We do look at this organ going, and we should look at where the ventilator goes to those who are able to make it or who have more lives to live if we give them the ventilator. So some people think, okay, now we have to trade off not lives versus economy, but number of years versus economy.
Wow.
So they look and say, look, most of the people that died in Italy the average age is 79 and above.
Wow.
And with that, should that make us make different conclusions, or we should not consider this factor, the number of years? And though that's a kind of a challenging issue, but this is an issue we also face in what's called normal conditions of allocating medical resources. There's another consideration which also emerges in this case, or unless you want to...
No, go ahead.
Which is the issue, the political issue, liberty versus safety.
Yes.
Now you are, as a journalist, you are interested in that stuff. So now we have to choose, and that's not between more safety and versus more liberty. Right. Now we've seen this before also as well, other contexts. So in case of wars or threat, after 9/11, for those who remember, there was a big debate then. We can achieve more safety by profiling people, by intruding on privacy, by over-investigation, by sometimes having special emergency situation. People were not happy, many people were not happy with this, as this is coming at the expense of liberties, political liberties, which we cherish, at least in many parts of the world. So to what extent you make a trade-off between safety on the one hand and liberty and privacy? Mm-hmm. Now there's a discussion about you have to test and trace. Should we impose testing on people? Should we trace their contacts? Who did they see in the last week? Mm-hmm. Those issues are political, but those issues are familiar from outside this pandemic situation we are in. We have seen them in other contexts. In the case of the pandemic, the main novelty is this idea of shutting down the economy versus saving lives. And that's why I find myself focusing on this one, because that's more than other important ethical questions pertain specifically to pandemics.
Okay. Yeah. So another dimension of the pandemic, another consequence, we're shutting the economies down and reducing global trade and travel. There's huge drop in people's incomes. And as you said, some people are protected by various mechanisms, but the majority probably are suffering somehow. When you get rising poverty, and some families, you had young kids or teenagers in the streets of Tripoli a few weeks ago, forgetting about the COVID curfews, going out in the streets and demonstrating and saying, I'm hungry, I can't eat, we need food, which was a direct consequence of economic stresses in Lebanon that were exacerbated very quickly by the COVID-related shutdown. So when you get mass suffering, then new questions arrive in society, right?
Yeah, I think maybe we need to make a kind of a distinction here. Some people argue against extending the lockdown by saying that the lockdown saves life but also kills others, yes, because this poverty results in death eventually, lots of death.
And sorry, not to interrupt, not only immediate suffering, but poverty means some people take their kids out of school,
yes,
they get the girls married early, the young kids go to work, they lose out on schooling, so they have lifelong poverty.
But some people argue actually not only problems, but they also die as a result. So there is alcoholism, suicide rates, and in poor countries, malnutrition would result early deaths.
And domestic abuse against women.
Yeah, but if you look at saving lives from COVID versus saving future lives from the effect of the economy. Now, people are not so clear about the effect of poverty on mortality.
Right.
Maybe in poor countries the effect is clear, but in rich countries there hasn't been any evidence that poverty leads to higher mortality. Right. In a new book by Agnes Deaton and Ann Cass, his partner, he's a Nobel Prize economics laureate, and they show that actually more people died before the Great Depression when economy was booming than after the Depression, in the 10 years after the Depression when the economy was slowing down. Wow. And they say that's because of traffic accidents, work-related accidents, pollution. The same thing applies to the recession in Southern Europe in the 2008. So sometimes it's not clear comparing deaths now versus deaths later. As you say, we're comparing saving lives now versus impoverishment later, even though not necessarily fatalities, but impoverishment.
Right.
So you can live very poorly, but you don't die.
Right.
And that's the difficult trade-off.
Yeah.
Trading death versus death is pretty more easy because you're trading the same things. You're trading apples versus apples. Now here we're trading apples versus oranges. And you're saying, which do you want to have more emphasis on? Yes.
We have more questions from Allison in the U.S.
Yes, people are making comments about the dynamics that you're setting up, and some have been wondering about the trade-off of having people be able to go online to AUB, for instance, but the emotional or the mental health trade-off of working, being a student from home, and not being able to be around other students or on campus. And someone has a question, that was a comment, and then someone has a question on, do you think individual families should be able to decide what is more of a threat to their household, getting sick or not being able to feed their children? Or should it be more of an expert-led or government policy?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think when governments decide these things, they have to calculate, you have to think about what would happen if we give people the choice. So in the case of Sweden, one argument for the Swedish model, now all these things are still under test, who got it right and who got it wrong. And of course, this is a kind of a pandemic Olympics now. Which country wins the gold medal? I think now that Germany is in the lead for the gold medal of dealing with the pandemic, and others are in a way losing, they're trailing behind, and others are still contesting. But in the case of Sweden, for example, people were given more leeway, more right to choose themselves, but telling them, be cautious. Now, some people argue that the Swedish model does not apply somewhere else. They would say, well, the Swedish people are more responsible and more informed about the risks. Level of education is high, responsibility is high, trust is high, and therefore what you can apply in Sweden might not apply somewhere else. So governments have to say, okay, how would my population behave if I tell them, be careful, it's up to you, be careful, this is something you have to take seriously, you are endangering other people's lives, so don't, these are the facts, you work around your own situation. Now, if you think that your population will think this is a license to go on partying on masses, then you might not give them this kind of discretion. No. So you have to assess how would your, use a bad word, how would your herd behave? Of course, I don't think it's a herd, but how would your population, citizens behave in this case? And that needs to be assessed. But of course, this is why people are actually testing all the time. They give people the right to go out and then realize, oh, they're actually misusing that privilege. And they go back and put it more restrictions. It's a kind of a trial and error type we are facing because it's a new phenomenon. There will be a lot of discussion, lots of research on the behavior of different governments and the behavior of the citizens there, as well as research on the science itself of the virus. And, we will learn a lot. I hope we don't learn a lot at our own expense in the meantime.
But back to the cultural question again, and I don't know if I'm being sort of making too many generalizations, but countries like Taiwan, South Korea, Vietnam in particular, China to a large extent, did really well in controlling the pandemic pretty much. Other countries you find in the United States, in parts of Europe, parts of the Middle East, there was a more contentious situation between individuals and the government, where some people said, I don't want to wear a mask, I want to go out and go to the beach. Do you find that the philosophical analysis of these issues actually should be adjusted for the context of different cultures, like Vietnam versus the United States?
I mean, it's difficult to make these generalizations on different cultures, but you might say that, in some places people are willing to go by the regulations more and obey rules. And I've been to Japan, a few times, and I could say that, maybe there is more of rule following there and adherence strictly to the instructions. You don't have stampedes in Japan. People stand in their turn for that. And I've heard once a story from a New York Times journalist in Japan. He said that they used to invite kids to birthdays and they play musical chair. And the Japanese kids don't rush to the chair, so they ruin the game. When the music stops, they ask you to come ahead. So you can't play musical chairs with them. But one should not exaggerate those differences. But maybe they are also relevant for assessing the policy. But there is also, we can observe that in many countries that are not doing well generally. They're doing well insofar as the COVID-19 is concerned.
Yes.
Lebanon is one of them.
Yes.
Lebanon is almost a failed state,
Yeah.
but doing quite well on the COVID-19. You know, Sweden is not a failed state, or Italy, or the UK. They're
Spain.
not. They're Spain.
Yeah.
You know, and the US, of course.
Yeah.
So we have in this case, maybe this has to do with the number of infections, not to do with the policy being made.
No.
But if you look at the world now, the success stories are not. They don't line up with with being developed or underdeveloped or
Right.
developing. So in a way,
Yeah.
there's a discrepancy between the way we classify economically and socially countries and how they do in facing the COVID-19.
So we've been talking a lot about the individual versus the group, the country,
Yeah.
the collective well-being of society. I want to throw in another dimension here, which is very obvious in the Middle East, but also in other places, but especially here, which is those intermediate groups, social groups, between the individual and the country as a whole, the tribe, the religious group, the ethnic group, non-governmental organizations, different organizations and religious groups and institutions, people that bring people together in a shared identity and offer services and in some cases political leadership as well. How do you factor in those kind of collective groups in society in the decision making and in the responsibility to alleviate the suffering as poor people get more and more?
Yeah, I mean, as in these cases, we have a kind of a phenomena that is also a good thing, a blessing and a risk as well. These groups are important, especially in countries where the state is not able to step in and provide support. They become the social safety net. The family, the village, maybe the tribe in some cases, sometimes
Right.
the sect helps. But of course, these groups comes with risks. And we are in a dilemma about it. Should we reject them, although they provide services, especially in times like this? They compensate for the missing state or the dysfunctional state, but they also come with certain risks. Now, in these cases, we need them in the COVID-19. At the same time, they tend to be groups that not necessarily malleable to the COVID-19 situation.
Right.
So there might be groups who would call for congregation, to going to church and to mosques and all of these things, and to big family gatherings.
Right.
So one has to look at the behavior. Now, some people said when the cases of Italy started to rise and the fatalities, one possible theory that was thrown then that Italians visit their grandmothers and grandfathers and elderly. And now we have a lot of people infected going to and that kind of family bonding led to actually higher fatalities among the elderly.
Right.
While when the elderly are left alone and not visited every week or every day, they are in a way have the 1 week or 10 days of safety until people realize there was an epidemic. So these things with this epidemic are still fluid, and we don't have a good grip on the mechanisms of this. But of course, you're not going to encourage people not to visit their grandmothers and grandfathers just because there might be someday a pandemic and they will be infecting them. So I don't think we can have a policy on this. You should visit your grandmothers anyway.
One last question. We've run out of time, but one last question. If we look at within AUB, does the philosophy department perhaps now have a slightly more acute role to play, a more clear role in engaging with other people, the medical school, the engineering department, the business school, the agriculture, nursing, and all of the social sciences? Are there mechanisms or needs that you can identify perhaps as all of society grapples with these issues?
I think everybody has a role now in this. In all departments of AUB have a role in this. I think maybe philosophy has a particular role when it comes to discussing these questions. And we've seen some people interested in that and discussing it. Now, some work will emerge as a result of this. Probably the post-COVID discussion will also be very rich, and hopefully the philosophy department and others will contribute to it. So, but it's a lot of us are for some time have been actually waiting and observing to understand what's going on. It took time for people to start to formulate views about how things should be handled. So I think people were also not aware of the nature of the virus, the nature of the effect of the lockdown. Would they find something that will mitigate the symptoms? So all of these things, will it affect young people? People were not, at some point, not clear about how this will affect. Will people become immune when they get it? All of these things make people unable to come in and contribute. But I think with time, philosophers and others will be able to say something useful about this.
So maybe we can anticipate that looking ahead to the fall semester, maybe we can get some interdisciplinary courses where you bring people from different faculties together to teach a course, because no single department or faculty can address these issues by itself.
Yeah, of course, and I think the pandemic will be, COVID-19 episode will be part of the syllabus of every interdisciplinary ethics course, whether in public health, medicine, economics, you name it.
Well, we've run out of time. That's the show for today. I want to thank Professor Bashshar Haydar for being with us, and Alison in New York, and the crew here, and also let you know that next week we have another fascinating discussion with Professor Abla Sibai, who is a professor in the Public Health School faculty, and she's also the president of the newly established Center for Studies on Aging in Lebanon. Her specialty is older people like me, and many of my old people friends now that we're around just over 70, and the aging people in society are particularly vulnerable, but also they have contributions to make, like when we read stories to our grandchildren and things like that. So we'll talk to Abla Sibai next week. I hope you'll join us, and thank you again, Professor.
Thank you very much
Haydar.
again. Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Bye-bye for now.
Thanks. Is it okay?